A holy woman claimed God sent her a vision, the Swedish king in bed, not with the queen, but with a venomous viper. Then, God whispered the viper's name, and it was the queen's own sister. This single accusation of incest was all it took to ignite a holy war and bring a kingdom to its knees. In the year 1335, within a cell that smelled of cold stone and beeswax, the noblewoman Birgitta Gudmarsdottir fell to her knees. The hard flagstones offered no comfort, only a stark, unyielding reality that seemed worlds away from the courtly life she had once known. Her hands, clasped together, were not raised in gentle supplication but clenched into white-knuckled fists of agonizing tension. A single candle flame, small and fragile, cast her long shadow against the damp wall, a dark and distorted echo of the turmoil that was about to consume her. But this was not an act of prayer for the salvation of the king's soul, nor for the health of his queen. Her devotion on this day was of a different, more violent nature. A tremor racked her body, a convulsion that seemed to start deep within her spirit and radiate outwards. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed upon the emptiness before her, yet they saw nothing of the rough-hewn crucifix or the sputtering light. She was a vessel, a conduit for a force that was tearing through her, using her sight for its own terrible purpose. The crude reality of her chamber dissolved, the stone melting away like mist to be replaced by a vision of impossible clarity and detail. She found herself looking not at her austere cell, but into the royal bedchamber, a space of opulent warmth and deep shadow, hung with heavy tapestries brought from Flanders and furnished with silks from the far south. At its heart, like a grand altar dedicated to dynasty and sin, stood the great canopied bed of the Swedish monarch, King Magnus IV. The king was not alone. But the form that lay beside him on the silken sheets was not that of his young wife, Queen Blanche of Namur. Instead, coiled upon the ermine furs in an embrace of profane intimacy, was a serpent. A venomous snake, a viper, its scales shimmering with a sickening iridescence in the spectral light of the vision. It was a creature of poison and corruption brought into the very heart of the kingdom's sanctum, its forked tongue flickering near the sleeping face of the king, a perfect, terrifying emblem of a mortal sin. And then a voice, which she believed to be the voice of Christ himself, whispered into the core of her soul, naming the creature. The name it spoke was the same as the queen's. For a moment, confusion warred with horror, a disorienting paradox, until the celestial voice clarified its terrible pronouncement with a chilling finality. This was not the queen herself, lying beside her husband. This was her shadow, her own blood, her sister. The royal court of Stockholm, in the middle of the 14th century, was an island of alien and conspicuous luxury adrift in a harsh and unforgiving northern landscape. It was a fragile bubble of warmth and color in a kingdom defined by vast, silent forests, iron-gray seas, and the grim, stoic endurance of its people. King Magnus, who had ascended to the throne as a mere boy, and his beautiful queen, Blanche, imported from the sophisticated and wealthy courts of Flanders, were attempting to perform a kind of cultural alchemy. They sought to transmute the raw, brutal reality of their Swedish capital into a glittering imitation of Paris, a northern beacon of refinement and courtly grace. They presided over a court that was a constant performance of continental elegance. Lavish feasts were held, where tables groaned under the weight of exotic dishes and rare wines, a shocking display of abundance in a land where famine was a recent and recurring memory. New fashions, dictated by the latest Parisian trends, were introduced and enforced. The heavy, practical wools of the north were replaced by fine silks, velvets, and complex, layered garments that were utterly unsuited to the biting Swedish winters. The court became a theater of appearances, a place where one's status was measured by the cut of their clothes and their ability to appreciate the latest imported novelty. Troubadours and minstrels, their art form a foreign import, were given patronage and prominence. Their delicate songs of chivalric, unrequited love and idealized beauty echoed through the halls of the royal castle. These complex, stylized tales of courtly romance, however, sounded a strange and discordant note against the grim backdrop of the kingdom's reality. Beyond the castle walls, the common folk were locked in a constant struggle for survival. Hunger was a familiar companion, and a new, more terrifying specter was beginning to loom on the horizon, the Great Pestilence, the Black Death, which was steadily creeping its way northward across Europe, a relentless, invisible army against which there was no defense. This profound disconnect between the life of the court and the life of the country did not go unnoticed. A low, persistent murmur of discontent began to rise from both the peasantry and the old, landed aristocracy. The common people, struggling to feed their families, looked upon the court's extravagant spending not with awe, but with a growing, bitter resentment. They saw a king who feasted while his subjects starved, a monarch who seemed more concerned with the quality of his musicians than with the state of his kingdom's granaries. The king and his foreign queen were becoming symbols of a profound and callous indifference. The old Swedish nobility, a class of proud, fiercely independent lords whose power was rooted in the land and in ancient traditions, harbored a different, more political kind of resentment. They saw the king's embrace of foreign culture as a betrayal of their own heritage. The new fashions, the French language that was becoming fashionable at court, and the elevation of foreign-born advisors were all seen as a deliberate attempt to dilute their power and marginalize their influence. They viewed Queen Blanche not as a symbol of a prestigious alliance, but as the source of this corrupting foreign influence, a beautiful, charming serpent poisoning the well of Swedish tradition. King Magnus himself, having been thrust into power at such a young age, struggled to command the respect of these hardened, powerful men. His refined tastes and his preference for the company of young, handsome courtiers over grizzled warlords were interpreted not as signs of a modern, enlightened monarch, but as weakness, effeminacy, and a dangerous detachment from the martial virtues that had forged the kingdom. The court he had built, intended as a monument to his sophisticated rule, was instead becoming a gilded cage, isolating him from the very people whose loyalty he needed to survive. And so, two separate and increasingly hostile worlds began to solidify within the kingdom of Sweden. There was the inner world of the court, a shimmering, self-contained universe of poetry, fashion, and intricate etiquette, presided over by a king and queen who saw themselves as champions of culture and refinement. And then there was the outer world, the vast, harsh, and suffering reality of Sweden itself, a world that looked upon the court not as a source of pride, but as a decadent, parasitic growth, draining the lifeblood of the nation. The stage was being set for a catastrophic collision, and all that was needed was a spark to ignite the smoldering resentment into a raging fire. The visions that assailed Birgitta in her seclusion did not cease. Instead, they intensified, becoming more frequent, more vivid, and infinitely more terrifying. The initial, shocking image of the viper in the royal bed was merely the prelude, the opening scene in a divine drama of corruption that now played out constantly behind her eyes. These were not fleeting images but prolonged, immersive experiences that left her physically exhausted and spiritually shaken. She became a reluctant spectator to the damnation of her king, forced by a power she dared not disobey to witness the full, detailed extent of the rot that had infested the heart of the kingdom. She saw not just a simple act of adultery, a common enough sin in the courts of Europe. What was revealed to her was a far deeper and more complex tapestry of depravity. Her visions depicted a veritable nest of sin, a royal court transformed into a hothouse where carnal lust had intertwined with the sacred bonds of blood and marriage to create monstrous new forms of corruption. The sin was not merely a personal failing of the king, it was a systemic sickness that had contaminated the entire royal family, turning their sacred lineage into a conduit for damnation. Compelled by a celestial command that was both terrifying and absolute, she began to document these divine pronouncements. With a quill that seemed to be guided by an unseen hand, she started to write down her revelations. These were not the gentle musings of a mystic, but the harsh, uncompromising indictments of a divine prosecutor. In these writings, which would become her revelations, Birgitta laid out the charges against the king with a brutal, terrifying clarity. She accused King Magnus not only of the incestuous affair with his wife's own sister, a sin that struck at the very heart of familial and sacramental order. But the accusations did not stop there. The visions revealed other, even darker transgressions, sins that the celestial voice labeled as unnatural. She wrote of the king's intimate and inappropriate closeness with his young male favorites, handsome courtiers whose influence at court was seen as a sign of a deeper, more profound perversion. Her language was veiled, using powerful metaphors and allegories, but the implication was clear and utterly damning. She was accusing the king of sodomy, a sin considered so monstrous that it was believed to call down the wrath of God not just upon the sinner, but upon the entire nation they ruled. Queen Blanche, in these divine revelations, was not portrayed as a wronged and innocent victim of her husband's infidelity. Instead, she was cast in a far more sinister role. The visions depicted her as a willing accomplice, a vain and malevolent woman who not only knew of her husband's depravities but actively encouraged and facilitated them. She was shown as a queen who cared more for her own power, her luxurious lifestyle, and her fine French clothes than for the immortal soul of her husband or the spiritual health of the kingdom. She was the gatekeeper to the king's debauchery, a Jezebel who bartered her honor to maintain her worldly status. The language of the revelations was breathtaking in its violence and its certainty. Brigida, speaking as the mouthpiece of God, did not mince words. She called the king a limp and useless limb of the kingdom, a ruler whose crown was a mockery and whose scepter was a tool of sin. She compared the queen to a venomous serpent, a beautiful but deadly creature who had poisoned the very heart of the nation. These were not mere criticisms, they were divine judgments, pronouncements of guilt delivered from the highest court in the universe, and they were intended to incite not just reflection, but revolution. Slowly, carefully, these written records of her visions began to circulate beyond the walls of her cell. Copies were made by trusted scribes and passed hand to hand among a select and influential audience. They reached the ears of high-ranking churchmen, bishops, and abbots who were already deeply concerned by the secular tone of the royal court and the king's encroachment on church privileges. They found their way into the hands of the powerful, landed nobles, the old aristocracy who saw their own influence waning and resented the king's favoritism towards his foreign-born queen and his young, upstart courtiers. And as these texts spread, they underwent a subtle but profound transformation. What had begun as the private, spiritual agonies of a devout noblewoman were now being weaponized. The revelations were no longer just pious visions, they were becoming a political manifesto, a divinely sanctioned justification for rebellion. For a nobleman chafing under a new royal tax, the king was not just a political opponent, but a sodomite who was angering God. For a bishop fighting for the church's legal immunities, the queen was not just a rival power, but a Jezebel leading the nation to ruin. Brigida's visions provided the moral and spiritual fuel for a fire of political discontent that was already smoldering. The whispers, now fortified by the unimpeachable authority of Brigida's perceived sanctity, escaped the rarefied circles of the nobility and the clergy and began to seep into the very soil of the kingdom. Like a contagion carried on the wind, the rumors spread from castle to town, from marketplace to tavern, from manor house to humble peasant hut. Brigida, already known for her piety and noble lineage, was now seen as a prophetess, a chosen vessel of God's wrath, and her visions were accepted not as allegations, but as divine, irrefutable truth. The seeds of her revelations had found fertile ground in the widespread and pre-existing discontent of the populace. What had once been a quiet undercurrent of dissatisfaction, the hushed complaints about high taxes, the grumbling about the queen's foreign ways, the quiet resentment of the king's aloofness, now swelled into a chorus of open and righteous condemnation. The abstract political and economic grievances of the people were given a new, terrifyingly concrete form. Their suffering was no longer the result of a bad harvest or complex political machinations, it was a direct consequence of the king's monstrous sins. The rumors provided a simple, powerful, and deeply satisfying explanation for all their woes, transforming vague discontent into a focused and holy anger. For the powerful landed nobles, who had long chafed under King Magnus' attempts to centralize power and diminish their feudal autonomy, Brigida's revelations were nothing short of a divine gift. Their purely political and self-interested opposition to the crown was instantly elevated into a sacred crusade. They were no longer rebellious vassals fighting for their own privileges, they were now righteous warriors, God's own instruments, called upon to cleanse the kingdom of a corrupt and sinful monarch. The accusations provided them with the ultimate moral justification for rebellion, a holy banner under which they could unite their disparate factions against a common, divinely condemned enemy. The clergy, too, seized upon the revelations with a fervent and righteous zeal. Many bishops and priests, already scandalized by the secular atmosphere of the court and its perceived infringement upon the church's authority, now saw their worst fears confirmed. From their pulpits, they began to preach with a new and fiery urgency. They spoke of the biblical cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, drawing direct and explicit parallels between their fiery destruction and the fate that awaited a kingdom ruled by a sodomite king. The royal palace in Stockholm was no longer just a center of political power, it was a new Babylon, a cesspit of depravity from which a spiritual pestilence was spreading across the land. Trapped within the gilded walls of their court, King Magnus and Queen Blanche found themselves ensnared in a perfect and inescapable trap. The accusations, built as they were on the unassailable foundation of divine revelation, were impossible to refute through conventional means. To deny the visions was to deny God himself, an act of blasphemy that would only serve to confirm their guilt in the eyes of the pious. They were caught in a web of whispers, a fog of sanctified slander against which their royal authority was proving to be utterly powerless. Every possible response was fraught with peril. If they were to use their royal power to arrest Brigida, to silence her by force, they would instantly transform her from a troublesome mystic into a holy martyr. Her imprisonment or execution would be seen as the ultimate proof of her vision's truth, the desperate act of guilty tyrants attempting to silence the voice of God. Her legend would only grow, and the rebellion against them would acquire the righteous fury of a holy war. They could not touch her without making their own situation infinitely worse. And so, they chose a different, equally ineffective, strategy: to ignore her, to dismiss her as a madwoman, a hysterical female whose visions were the product of a fevered and deluded mind. They instructed their loyal courtiers to spread counter-rumors, painting her as an ambitious and manipulative political operator, a pawn of their enemies. But this approach was also doomed to fail. To the common people, who already saw the court as a place of moral corruption, the king's dismissal of a famously pious woman only reinforced their belief that he was a godless tyrant, incapable of recognizing true holiness. The poison of the rumors had already seeped too deep into the bloodstream of the kingdom. It was an infection of the mind, a spiritual plague that was proving to be far more destructive than any physical disease. Every misfortune that befell the kingdom, a failed crop, a cattle sickness, a storm that sank a trading ship, was now interpreted through the lens of the king's sins. The natural hardships of medieval life were recast as divine punishments, signs of God's growing displeasure. The king and queen were no longer just rulers, they were the cause of all suffering, the Jonahs on the ship of state who had to be thrown overboard to appease the wrath of heaven. The anointing oil of kingship, once a sacred shield, now offered no protection. The slow-burning fuse of rumor and discontent finally reached the powder keg of political ambition, and the kingdom of Sweden exploded into the chaos of civil war. The abstract crisis of faith and morality now manifested itself in the brutal, physical reality of armed conflict. The simmering political tensions, sanctified and inflamed by Brigida's divine pronouncements, boiled over into open, organized rebellion. The whispers of the court and the sermons of the pulpit were replaced by the harsh, metallic clamor of steel striking steel, the thunder of hooves on frozen ground, and the cries of men dying for a cause they had been told was holy. The great lords of the realm, the powerful nobles who had long resented Magnus' rule, now saw their moment. Cloaking their raw, secular ambition in the sacred vestments of a religious crusade, they raised their banners in revolt. Their declared purpose was not the seizure of power for themselves, but the spiritual purification of the kingdom. They were not rebels, they insisted, but redeemers, righteous instruments of God's will, compelled by divine command to depose a king whose sins had brought the nation to the brink of heavenly retribution. This holy pretext gave their treason a powerful and compelling legitimacy, attracting lesser nobles and discontented knights to their cause like moths to a righteous flame. The most devastating weapon in their arsenal, however, was not forged of steel but of flesh and blood. They turned their attention to the king's own son, the young Prince Eric, the heir to the throne. The rebel lords, a council of grim-faced, ambitious men, began a systematic and insidious campaign of psychological warfare against the young prince. They fed him a constant diet of curated truths and sanctified lies, presenting him with edited versions of Brigida's revelations. They whispered in his ear that his own father was not just a flawed ruler, but a monster, a creature of unnatural lusts whose continued reign was an abomination in the sight of God. They poisoned the well of filial loyalty, transforming a son's natural love and duty into shame and horror. They convinced the young, impressionable, and ambitious prince that his father's sins had tainted his own bloodline, that his inheritance was not a crown but a curse. They presented him with a terrible choice: to remain loyal to a damned father and share in his inevitable divine punishment, or to rise up, cleanse the throne, and save both the kingdom and his own immortal soul. Framed in these stark, apocalyptic terms, the choice was inevitable. The young prince, his heart heavy with a toxic mixture of ambition and manufactured piety, agreed to lead the rebellion against his own father. The kingdom, already fractured by discontent, now split open along a new, horrifying fault line, that of family. The spectacle of a son raising an army to march against his own father was a profound shock to the natural order, a violation of the most sacred of bonds. Allegiances were no longer clear. Lords who might have remained loyal to the king found themselves unable to fight against his legitimate heir. Families were torn apart, with brothers choosing opposing sides, their ancestral lands becoming the battlegrounds for a conflict that was as much a family tragedy as it was a political struggle. Sweden became a chessboard of shifting loyalties and brutal, intimate betrayals. For King Magnus and Queen Blanche, the world they had so carefully constructed collapsed around them. Just a short time before, they had been the undisputed center of their universe, the most powerful and glamorous figures in all of Sweden. Now, they were transformed into hunted animals, their gilded court becoming a gilded prison of fear and paranoia. Every new dispatch from the countryside brought news of another defection, another castle lost, another town that had declared its allegiance to the rebel prince. Their allies, once numerous, began to melt away, unwilling to tie their own fortunes to a sinking royal ship. Their names, once spoken with reverence, were now openly cursed in the streets. They became the scapegoats for every hardship, the focal point for all the accumulated misery and fear of the populace. A drought that withered the crops was not an act of nature, but a sign of the king's impurity. The arrival of the plague in a coastal town was not a medical crisis, but the fulfillment of Brigida's prophecies, the tangible manifestation of God's wrath against their sinful rulers. They were no longer seen as human, but as the demonic source of all the kingdom's suffering, their sins having torn a hole in the fabric of the divine order. In a strange and terrifying way, Brigida's prophecies were indeed coming true. But they were not being fulfilled by a vengeful God in heaven, they were being enacted on earth by the very people who had come to believe in them. The visions of chaos and destruction were not a prediction of the future, but a blueprint for it. The people, convinced that their king's sins would lead to ruin, acted in ways that ensured that ruin would come to pass. The rebellion, the civil war, the collapse of royal authority, all of it was a self-fulfilling prophecy, a catastrophe created by the very belief that it was inevitable. The final act of the tragedy played out with the grim, inexorable logic of a Greek play. The momentum of the rebellion, fueled by a potent combination of aristocratic ambition and popular piety, proved to be unstoppable. King Magnus, his armies defeated and his authority shattered, was ultimately captured and forced to abdicate. The crown, which he had worn since boyhood, was stripped from him, his reign ending not with a bang, but with the quiet scratch of a quill signing away his kingdom. He who had been the anointed king, the sacred heart of the nation, became a landless exile, a ghost haunting the edges of the kingdom he had once ruled. His sophisticated court, once a beacon of continental culture, was dismantled, its poets scattered, its silks and velvets sold off to pay the wages of the rebel soldiers. The fate of the queen and the rebel prince was even darker, a chilling coda of poison and paranoia. After a brief and troubled co-rule with his father, the victorious Prince Eric died suddenly and mysteriously. Shortly thereafter, Queen Blanche, now a prisoner of the new political order, also perished in captivity. The official cause of their deaths was the plague, a convenient and ever-present explanation in the 14th century. But a more sinister rumor, born in the toxic atmosphere of fear and betrayal, quickly took root and spread. It was whispered that the queen, in a final, desperate act of maternal ambition or vengeful rage, had poisoned her own son to secure the throne for a younger child, and had then either taken her own life or been quietly eliminated by her political enemies. The truth was buried with them, leaving only a dark and sordid legend. The dynasty, once so secure, was now utterly broken, its primary line extinguished in a maelstrom of rebellion, suspicion, and death. The royal family had effectively consumed itself, devoured from within by the very forces of ambition and piety that were supposed to sustain it. The kingdom of Sweden, exhausted by years of civil war and weakened by the plague, was left politically adrift, its throne now a prize to be fought over by rival noble factions and opportunistic foreign powers. The sophisticated world that Magnus and Blanche had tried to build had been razed to the ground, leaving behind only the bitter ashes of a failed dream. And what of Brigida Gudmarsdottir, the woman whose visions had served as the divine spark for this all-consuming political fire? As the kingdom she had helped to destabilize descended into chaos, she removed herself from the wreckage. Her work in Sweden was done. Leaving behind the war-torn and impoverished nation, she embarked on a new and even more ambitious pilgrimage, this time to the very heart of Christendom, Rome. She was no longer just a Swedish noblewoman, she was now a figure of international renown, a prophetess whose divine revelations were spoken of with awe and reverence in the courts and monasteries of Europe. In Rome, she cemented her status as a living saint. She continued to receive visions, her divine commentary now expanding to encompass the sins of popes and cardinals, her courage in speaking truth to power only enhancing her formidable reputation. She gathered a devoted circle of followers, founded a new monastic order, and became a powerful spiritual advisor to some of the most influential figures in Europe. When she finally died, it was not as a prisoner in a cold castle, but peacefully, in a state of grace, surrounded by her adoring disciples. She had successfully navigated the treacherous currents of politics and religion, transforming herself from a provincial mystic into a bona fide spiritual celebrity. But her story did not end with her death. Years later, after a long and thorough investigation, the highest authorities of the Catholic Church in Rome officially examined her life's work, her voluminous and controversial revelations. They weighed the testimony of her followers, scrutinized her writings for any trace of heresy, and debated the divine origin of her visions. In the end, they reached a stunning conclusion. Her revelations, the very texts that had accused a king of incest and sodomy and had served as the justification for a catastrophic civil war, were declared to be authentic, divinely inspired messages from God. The final, improbable act of the drama was her canonization. Birgitta Gudmarsdottir, the woman who had, wittingly or unwittingly, destroyed a royal family with her accusations of sexual sin, was officially declared a saint of the Catholic Church. The prophetess of doom was transformed into a heavenly intercessor. And in a final, breathtaking irony, she was eventually named the patron saint of the very country whose royal dynasty she had helped to annihilate, Saint Birgitta of Sweden. Her victory was absolute, her legacy sealed not just in the annals of history, but in the sacred liturgy of the Church itself. And so, the story ends, but the central, haunting question remains, suspended forever in the mists of history. Were Birgitta's visions truly the authentic voice of a righteous and angry God, a divine intervention to cleanse a kingdom of a corrupt and sinful king? Or was she a political genius of the highest order, a master manipulator who understood the immense power of piety in a credulous age? Was she the unwitting pawn of an ambitious aristocratic faction, her genuine religious fervor expertly channeled and exploited for their own secular ends? The ultimate truth is unknowable, lost to a past that guards its secrets well, leaving us with only the chilling, undisputed fact: a kingdom was broken, a dynasty was destroyed, and the woman who lit the fuse was rewarded with a halo.